All right. Well, Bill, first, thanks very much for providing us with that film here this morning. We're going to turn next to a man. This is a set of a number of people, but in this case it is truly deserving, needs no introduction. Senator John McCain is the leading Republican in the U.S. Congress, ranking member on the Armed Services Committee, and a man of tremendous integrity who has taken strong positions on human rights around the world, in Syria most recently, but also when it comes to Russia. So Senator McCain, if I can, I'd like to turn that over to you. Thank you.
Thank you for everything that Freedom House continues to do on behalf of people around the world who suffer oppression and persecution, and I'm honored to have known you and to have the opportunity to work with you around the world. And Bill, you're a genuine American hero. You're a person who, without your unrelenting efforts and sacrifice, we would not be where we are today. I remember the first time we met, where you came to my office, and frankly, I found the story hard to believe. You know, if you wrote a novel, nobody would believe it or read it as to this series of events. And the corruption level obviously goes to the highest levels of the Russian government, which is what is so dispiriting about this whole story. And it's dispiriting in the context that obviously Vladimir Putin, despite our hopes, has certainly taken a turn to the right on a variety of issues, latest obviously being Russia's blocking of any resolution through the UN Security Council concerning the massacre that continues to take place in Syria. But this story is one that needs to be told around the world. It needs to be told because the courage and dedication of one person, Sergei Magnitsky, should be an example and a motivation to all of us. The publicly available documents and records that he uncovered, as we've just seen, continue to have a lasting impact on our world. Obviously, he exposed the pervasive corruption that sadly exists within the government, including, as we've just seen, the largest public theft in Russian history. His work and Bill's relentless efforts to draw attention to it has also now brought to light the connection between Russian officials and the dangerous transnational criminal organization known as the Kluyev Group. By the way, I take it that real estate in Dubai is pretty expensive. I don't think I'm going to be able to invest there. But the information he uncovered, as we highlighted in this film, should be of concern to every American. If true, it means that a major transnational criminal organization is colluded with officials of the Russian Federation to engage in bribery, embezzlement, fraud, commit company thefts, and possibly numerous murders. I take it that heart disease is a growing problem in Russia today. Furthermore, you know, the laundering mechanism, use of similar money laundering mechanism used by Mexican drug smugglers and North Korean and Iranian weapons traffickers. The information that Sergei uncovered suggests that the U.S. financial system may have even been compromised and abused by this criminal organization. Today, I'm sending a letter to President Obama requesting that his administration fully review this important information and begin a process to consider whether to designate and sanction the Kluyev Group under Executive Order 13581, which the President issued last year to help defend the national security and financial system of the United States from transnational criminal groups. I fully support the President's action in this case, and based on what we have learned today, I think there's a compelling reason to believe that this executive order should be applied to the Kluyev Group. Such an action would be a powerful complement to the Congress's consideration of the Magnitsky Act, which I fully expect to be moved through the Senate Foreign Relations Committee at its business meeting this afternoon. Based on the letter that Senator Max Baucus, chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, sent to me earlier this month, I'm confident that we now have a path to passing the Magnitsky Act together with legislation that would extend the permanent national trade relations status to Russia. And the point is that we've made it clear to the administration that we will not agree to the passage of permanent national trade relations, known as PNTR, unless the Magnitsky bill in its entirety is passed alongside it. Now, there have been numerous efforts on the part of the administration to water down this bill. Each one we have rebuffed. Among others, they wanted the weakest kind of national security exemption. We will not agree to that. We will only agree to the letter and intent of this legislation. And I want to pay special appreciation to Senator Cardin, who has been a leader on this issue and one that we are very appreciative of. Now, the Russians have said this is an anti-Russian piece of legislation. I couldn't disagree more. I believe the Magnitsky Act is pro-Russia. I believe the Russian people want corrupt officials to be held accountable and punished for their crimes. I believe the Russian people agree with us that corrupt officials who steal money from the citizens and government of Russia should not be able to hide it in U.S. banks or use it to finance shopping trips and vacations in the United States. It would serve Russia's interest to expand free trade through PNTR, but it would also serve Russia's interest to use the Magnitsky Act to hold corrupt officials accountability for their crimes, and it would serve Russian interests for the United States to use the tools at our disposal to weaken and punish transnational criminal organizations like the Kluyev Group, which are stealing money from the Russian people. All of this would serve Russia's interest, would serve American interest, and it's my hope we could accomplish all three of these actions this year. I want to thank Bill and David again, and all of you for your continued support. We can't do it without you, and we've only come as far as we have because of you. All I can say again is that it's a gripping story. It's a story of one man's dedication to the life and freedom, not only to his close associate and friend, but also on behalf of Russian people who have been subjected to this kind of tyranny and criminal activity at the highest levels of Russian government. And David, I want to thank you again for your continued advocacy of human rights and freedom throughout the world. As an aside, yesterday I met with the Vice President of the Vietnamese National Assembly, and one of the things I told her was that we rely on organizations like Freedom House. And we didn't rely on her word or mine, but we relied on organizations like yours to make judgments about corruption, persecution of minorities, Catholics, Buddhists, and that if they expect improvement in relations between our two countries, that we expect better judgments from organizations like Freedom House. By the way, that was well received on my end. So I want to thank all of you for coming. I think this is what America is all about and what we are supposed to do as a beacon for people all around the world. Thank you very much.
For those terrific words, and also appreciate the plug for Freedom House. That was very kind of you. We're open for questions from the audience, if there are any. If we could, do we have mics? Yeah, if we could get mics there. Yes, please.
Yeah, hi, I'm Susan Cornwell with Reuters. Senator McCain, if the administration does what you are suggesting and they ban the Kluyev group or sanction them under this executive order, is it not the case then that perhaps you wouldn't need the Magnitsky bill because the impact would be quite similar? And the second question is, I think in the bill as it stands now, there's a classified annex that could be used by the administration if they don't want to make the names public. I wonder what you thought about that.
On the first question, I think there's nothing as compelling and attention-getting than an act of Congress. And I'm not sure, frankly, we are suggesting to the President that he take the action that we are recommending, but we're not sure that they will. Second of all, I think that if this legislation is passed through the committee and comes to the floor of the Senate, that will send a very, very strong and public message with far more impact, frankly, than an executive order. The second
About the classification part. About having a classified part that some names.
You know, I have very mixed emotions about that. I wanted to talk with Bill about that as to whether he thinks that's most effective, and maybe Bill can weigh in on that. I always worry about classified information when the fact is our whole effort here is to make public the names and the actions of the people that we think are engaged in these crimes that we just watched. So I really have deep concerns about that. Bill, do you want to?
Yeah, I think that the problem that we've had in the last 2 years as we've tried to bring this Magnitsky case forward is that the State Department at every step has rebuffed the efforts to do anything. So it started out that Senator Cardin sent a request to the State Department in April of 2010 requesting that the State Department invoke Executive Order 7750, which allows them to ban corrupt foreign officials. And a couple months later, they replied to his request and rejected it. On the back of that, Senator Cardin and Senator McCain launched the Magnitsky Act, which has had several iterations, but the latest iteration was one which not only sanctioned Magnitsky killers, but all other gross human rights violators in Russia and other places. This was a very powerful piece of legislation, and the State Department then wrote back to Senators Cardin, McCain, and others that there's no need for this legislation because they've now decided to ban the Magnitsky killers. At this point, the senators asked the State Department, who have you banned? And they said, that's classified. How many people have you banned? That's also classified. Have you frozen their assets? We don't think that's a good policy. What about the other gross human rights abusers? That's classified. So it all comes down to what's the State Department's intent. And I would argue that the words in the bill could easily be abused by the State Department, whether it's a classified annex or not. And so one of the things which I'm on Capitol Hill doing this week is requesting various supporters of the Magnitsky Act to ask the State Department to publicly clarify whether the Magnitsky 60 are going to be classified. And they can't say this is a speculative issue. They've known about the Magnitsky 60 since day one. And if they refuse to answer that question, then it shows that their intent is not honorable. If they say, yes, those people will be on the public list, then I don't have as much worry about how these annexes work.
Could I just add to that? Senator Baucus and I have worked together on this issue, and he, with my help and input, sent me a letter specifically laying out the provisions of the legislation that would be passed. And it is a very detailed letter because of these problems that we've had. I will hold the Senate to that commitment, and so will enough of us that we either pass the Magnitsky Act without significant changes, or we don't pass PNTR for Russia. It's that simple.
The only other point I would add is if people are involved in gross human rights abuses, murder, torture, it's beyond my comprehension why we would want to keep that information classified. I think the key to this is to shine a spotlight on the abuses and on the abusers. And from the perspective of the head of the oldest human rights organization in the US, to me, having a classified section is completely contrary to the spirit of this legislation. This is designed to shine a spotlight on these abuses and abusers. I think there was a question, yes, right there.
Yeah.
Hi, Mr. Browder, I actually met you at an event in London back in, I think it was November.
Could you identify yourself?
Oh, hi, my name is Sarah, and I work for the United States Senate. And anyways, one of the questions that was actually posed to you at the end of the event, I kind of want to ask again. You know, now that the bill is moving forward and coming up for a vote, what do you see as the broader implications on human rights in a global perspective, if and when the Magnitsky Act passes?
Well, the Magnitsky Act is not going to change human rights abuses in its entirety, but it could change the incentives that people have on the margin. And what you have to understand is that people who commit these abuses, people in this movie and the people who killed Sergei Magnitsky, did so because they were guaranteed impunity. They knew from their bosses that if they did these crimes, nothing would happen to them. And as a result, they go and do their crimes. And it's not just in Russia, it happens elsewhere in the world. If you have a piece of legislation which says that the people's bosses can't guarantee that they won't be punished in some way, maybe not the most severe punishment in the world, banning their travel or freezing their assets, but as a punishment. If you have a prison guard in some North African country that's abusing prisoners, or is being told to abuse prisoners, and he thinks to himself, well, if this gets out, I won't ever be able to travel again, he may decide to call in sick that day. And my hope, and the reason that I've been working on this so hard, is that I'm hoping that Sergei Magnitsky's legacy is one where his name is on a piece of legislation which creates a strong disincentive and ends impunity, so that there's, at least on the margin, people who are questioning whether they should participate in these human rights abuses. And I think it will change things in the world.
And I would just add that we should not want people who engage in these kinds of abuses to enjoy the privilege of coming to the United States, to park their ill-gotten gains in the United States. And I worry a little bit that this would be applied globally and therefore get applied nowhere. You have to start somewhere. In this case, and we just saw it laid out so clearly in this video, I think suggests Russia's a good place to start. We had done it in Belarus too, but in the case of Belarus, they don't put their money in the West. They don't travel to the West very much. But in this case, Russians put their money in the West. They like to travel in the West. And if we deny them that privilege, as Bill said, then the incentive to engage in these kinds of abuses from which they get these ill-gotten gains, I think, goes away. There had been a gentleman there, and then I'll come to all of them.
Jeff Dyer from the Financial Times. I wonder if I'd ask Senator McCain on this issue of whether you think the Magnitsky bill should just be focused on the people involved in this case, or whether it should be a broader issue of human rights abuses in Russia. And if you do believe it should be a much broader definition, is there a risk somewhere that this will be abused and you'll get cases which are not nearly as clearly documented as this one, and that people with a certain agenda will come along and get their own enemies included on your list of banned citizens?
I think part of our work has to be the art of the possible. And I think that by this rather narrow focus that we have a much greater opportunity of passage of the legislation. But as David just pointed out, I think it sends a message to a lot of people, not just in Russia, but around the world, that they can't get away with this kind of activity. I think if I had my druthers, it would be broader in scope. But right now, by having it relatively narrow, the chances of passage through the United States Senate are excellent.
Yes, right there. There and then there.
Thank you. Caroline, Le Monde newspaper. Senator McCain, last week at the G20, Vladimir Putin threatened some kind of retaliation if that bill is passed. How concerned are you about, for example, the help the United States is getting in Afghanistan? And more broadly, do you think the United States are still in a position to put human rights at the center of their foreign policy?
The last part, actually, I didn't catch. But
What impact could this have on the relations?
Right.
Well, I think one thing showed that it's pretty clear that pushing that reset button it's not working out too well. A lot of questions that even I had after Vladimir Putin assured his continued rule in Russia for at least 12 years, unless the Russian people decide differently through other means, was whether he would be more cooperative with the West or whether he would become more hardline. And I think the answer is pretty well clear, that in his statements about missile defense, continued vetoing of any resolution on Syria, one of his military leaders said that if the United States continues our missile defense efforts, which are clearly defensive, that this could lead to military confrontation. I've watched a number of meetings between world leaders, but I doubt if I'd seen anyone quite like the body language that existed between Putin and our president in that meeting. It was remarkable. Both of them had to look on their faces like they'd rather be anywhere else than in that room. So I think it's pretty clear that Vladimir Putin has decided to take a rather hard line. And why he's doing all that, whether it goes back to his origins as a KGB colonel or whether it goes back to concerns about internal dissent within Russia, the demonstrations, he still hasn't gotten Chechnya totally under control, is not clear to me. But I think one thing is clear, that we cannot expect a lot of cooperation from Russia on issues that affect the world today. Now maybe there will be some that Russia feels is in their interest to cooperate with us, but overall there is a more adversarial environment between the United States and Russia that I've seen since the Berlin Wall came down.
And this legislation, I think, also gets at their vulnerability. Capital flight last year from Russia was $84 billion. It's already $45 billion through May of this year, which means that the Russians don't keep their money in Russia, they send it to the West. Or they invest in properties, as we saw in the video. They like to send their children to study in the West, or their wives or others to live and vacation. And so we found that they're vulnerable, and I think that explains the reaction that we've heard for almost a year now, that this is going to destroy the reset. At the end of the day, because Russia is moving in the wrong direction when it comes to values, they're moving further away from us. That is what's limiting our ability to cooperate, as Senator McCain said. I think that's absolutely right, not this legislation. Jackson-Vanik was passed in 1974, in a decade in which several arms control agreements were signed. We were still able to get some things done with the Soviet Union. So passing this legislation gets at the heart of the problem on human rights. But if Russia wants to cooperate with us on some issues, it can still do so. There's a question right here.
And I'm over-answering your question, but let me just add one additional point. Most economists believe, because of Russia's dependence on oil, that when the price of a barrel of oil goes down $100, below $100 a barrel, that it starts hurting the Russians' economy very badly. Apparently, for a variety of reasons, including long-term, the United States, by using and exploiting natural gas, will reduce our dependence on foreign oil. That it's not good news for Vladimir Putin. And already we have seen demonstrations that are almost unprecedented in the history of the country.
Question.
Senator McCain, I'm Allison Good with Foreign Policy Magazine.
Excellent magazine.
Thanks. Secretary Clinton is slated to meet with Foreign Minister Lavrov later this week in St. Petersburg. And I was wondering if you two had any sort of discussion about whether the Magnitsky issue will be on the docket, and just in general, what has reception from the top echelons of State Department been about the Magnitsky issue?
Well, on the Magnitsky issue, the State Department has been less than enthusiastic. They understand the sentiment in the Congress on the issue, and there have been numerous attempts to water down the legislation. A lot of that is understandable because that's how bureaucracies react. They like to have more control, but some of it, I think, in the State Department, and I admire the leadership in the State Department very much, but is, I think, based on an unfounded assumption or optimism that things are going to improve between the United States and Russia. I have not seen that improvement. I think that if we hold fast, that the State Department will come around and agree with our position. But they have, on numerous occasions, tried to water down this legislation. The latest is, of course, this secret annex.
Question?
President of the Voice of America. I actually came from Sergei Magnitsky's hometown, Nalchik, in the North Caucasus. And my home region is notorious for human rights violations. My question is to Senator McCain, how the Sergei Magnitsky Act, the legislation, will affect those involved in human rights violations in the North Caucasus? Thank you.
I admire our Secretary of State a great deal. I think she has had a very beneficial influence around the world with her leadership and her popularity. I believe that this administration came to office with the absolute conviction that the Bush administration had mishandled relations with Russia, and that there would be a whole new era of improved relations between the United States and Russia. And that's why I start out with the reset button, which, you know, as you may recall, the word was misspelled, but other than that, it was a good gimmick. And so it's hard for them to not to cling to this idea that if we just can find some path to that Vladimir will come around to our way of thinking. I think you also have to look at these people's backgrounds. All of them basically are old KGB cronies. And I must tell you one brief anecdote. I was in a meeting with Sergei Lavrov, and he looked me in the eye and he said, "I can assure you that Russian equipment is not being used in Syria." Now that really harkens back to the old days of the Cold War, where people would just say something that's patently false right to your face. So I think that slowly the administration is beginning to realize that, particularly the failure of this meeting between the President and Vladimir Putin just the other day, that they're beginning to realize that we are dealing with a country that we have to be realistic about. Now, I want to emphasize, the Cold War is not going to start again. We're not going to have a nuclear confrontation. We're not going to have all that. But relations between the United States and Russia, I think, are going to be very difficult because of the nature of their government and the nature of Putin's attitude towards our two countries. So, but we can deal with it. We just have to deal in a far more realistic fashion, in my view.
Question right there.
Lauren Fox with U.S. News and World Report. Senator McCain, I was hoping that you could shed a little bit of light on your first reactions to the story when it was brought to you, and kind of just anecdotally tell the story of how that meeting went.
Bill came to my office, and I didn't know who he was nor anything about him, but it was recommended by several others that I meet with him. He came to my office. I was deeply moved by not only the story, but his passion, his commitment, based on a friendship and a sense of obligation that Bill had to Sergei, because he was unable to get him out of Russia in time. And I'm sure that kept you awake on a number of nights. So I was deeply impressed. and deeply moved. And so that really is what was the beginning of the effort that I engaged in. But I want to repeat again, Senator Cardin has played a very, very key and important role on this issue, and it's been a great honor for me to work with him. And the work that he's done, frankly, has been more substantial than mine. And so, but every once in a while, people can change things. Bill is an example of bringing about something that would never have happened without him. And that's what I think we all try to, when we leave, to be looked back upon.
And Senator, I think
tragically, I have to go cast one of the most critical votes in history, probably on a judge or a motion to proceed, one of those really earth-shaking votes that we think periodically. I apologize, and I want to thank you.
Senator, thanks very much. Bill and I can take any further questions. One thing I did want to emphasize that the Senator referred to is this bill actually started out with two Democrats leading the charge. Senator Cardin from Maryland in the Senate side, of course, and then Jim McGovern, Democrat from Massachusetts on the House side. Without their leadership on this bill would not be where it is today. So there had been a question in the front. Yes.
Oh,
hold on for a mic, just 1 second.
Yeah, no problem.
Just so for those in the press and those who are interested, the announcement that Senator McCain made about the executive order 13581 to prescribe the Kluyev organized crime group is on the Russian Untouchables website, www.russianuntouchables.com, and so you can look at the exact wording of the words that he's expressed to the President and the Treasury Secretary after this question and answer.
The film does a fantastic job of highlighting the Magnitsky case, and I'm just curious what other things you guys are doing in terms of social things, you guys and other groups perhaps that are bringing social awareness and perhaps pressure to make changes regarding issues such as these.
Well, the most important thing we're doing at the moment is taking the same legislation that we're working on in America and rolling it out in 11 other countries. The Russian elite, the regime, likes to travel not just to America but to Europe. And they like to go to France and Italy and various places like that. And so we're working on a similar Magnitsky legislation across Europe and also in Canada. And our very, very strong efforts that we're putting in right now intend to basically close off their ability to enjoy their ill-gotten gains and their blood money in the West. Now, there are a number of different tools we're using, and the basic objective is just to, in the most granular possible way, to get all the information about what we know about these people, what they did to Sergei, how they tortured him, how they got rich, how they've lived their lives, so the whole world knows it in all different ways, and you can see it in documents and websites and on our website and in these videos and various other things. And the objective is, if everybody knows it, then it makes it much easier to pass laws to make sure that these people don't get to enjoy their ill-gotten gains and eventually face justice.
I would just add, this case, I think, from my perspective, as head of the Human Rights Organization, gets at the heart of what's rotten in Russia. There are other cases like this. There have been other people who have been kept in jails, denied treatment, and died essentially murdered in prison. You have the Khodorkovsky case, which is a gross abuse of the judicial system to keep a perceived opponent of Putin in prison. There's a whole series of these, and the problem of corruption. The Indem think tank in Russia has estimated that corruption in Russia costs the economy somewhere between 25 and 35% of its wealth. Some $300 to $500 billion is siphoned away in corrupt means from a GDP of $1.5 trillion. a staggering sum. And so this is a regime, and it's important to separate the regime from the people and from the country as a whole. This regime, I would argue, is one that's just thoroughly corrupt and rotten. And this case, I think, is a very sad way of highlighting the problems that we see. And a few more, and then we'll wrap up.
Mr. Browder, a question for you with regard to your personal security, except for the accusations against you in Russia. Did you encounter any pressure threats in the places, for example, in Britain, because we all remember the Litvinenko case, so did you take any precautions in this regard?
Since about 2 weeks before Sergei died until now, either I or my colleagues have received 11 death threats in the form of text messages and voicemails from unregistered numbers in Russia, which the only way you can have an unregistered number is coming from somebody in the services, the secret services. I don't talk about precautions that I take, but you can imagine that when you poke the bear, they get pretty angry, and we're certainly poking the bear here.
I have 2 ferocious mini dachshunds.
Well, thank you, David. My name is Edward. I work for the Senate Finance Committee, and I just wanted to thank you and Bill for what you're doing in keeping this issue at the forefront. It's really been critical to moving legislation through the Senate. One of the things that we are struggling with is trying to discern what is the resistance in the Magnitsky bill itself, and whether it is due to concern of how it will affect the reset policy or the actual substance of the bill. One of the reasons we are kind of struggling with this is when you look at how the trade policies towards other parts of the world have been conducted, say Latin America and even South Korea, where they were held to a standard on labor rights that was quite strenuous. In fact, trade agreements didn't move for several years simply because of social issues. We're having trouble reconciling that with their approach to the trade with Russia, where it's hurry up and negotiate the agreement and hurry up and get it across the finish line with no other elements being considered. And those to us seem somewhat inconsistent. So we're struggling with that and trying to determine whether it's being driven by a desire to validate the reset policy, or is the actual policies itself that they are opposed to. And I just wonder if you have any comments on that.
Just
sure.
What's the perspective that I can bring to this, which is different than anyone else's, is I've been to 12 countries trying to do the same thing, the same Magnitsky Act, as I'm trying to do here in America. And what I've discovered is it's almost universal. And I don't think it depends on whether you have a Democrat or Republican or a Tory or a Labor or anything. Basically, anybody, any foreign minister, any foreign secretary, any secretary of state is afraid of Russia. They're absolutely afraid of doing anything to upset Russia. Russia goes around the world in a fashion that's just different than any other country in terms of bullying, in terms of threatening, and so on. And I think that it basically comes down to just fear. That it's not, I don't think there's any policy issue whatsoever. I think that the White House and the State Department are just terrified of Vladimir Putin. And I see the same thing. And just to give you an example, in Holland, we went to the Dutch Parliament, and I testified in front of the Foreign Affairs Committee of the Dutch Parliament. And there were, I think, 5 different political parties there. They heard my story. They were moved by the story in the same way Senator McCain was moved, and various other people in different parts of the world. They put on the agenda of the Parliament to vote for a resolution calling on the Dutch government to impose visa sanctions and asset freezes on the people who killed Sergei Magnitsky. The Dutch Foreign Minister, Yuri Rosenthal, came and spoke in front of the Parliament and urged them strongly not to vote in favor of this resolution, because it would complicate his relations with Russia. And the Parliament then voted, and they voted 150 in favor, 0 opposed. A full unanimous call of the Parliament on the Dutch Foreign Minister to do this. He still hasn't done it. There's an incredible fear of Russia.
The only thing I would add is China is a very good case where PNTR has done nothing to advance human rights there. I support PNTR and graduating Russia from Jackson-Bannock because I think it should have been done years ago. That legislation was very effective for its time in dealing with a problem that really doesn't exist, fortunately, anymore. But I think what's critical is to, in the same time as Senator McCain was saying to lift Jackson-Bannock for Russia, to put in place legislation that deals with today's challenges in Russia. And that's why I think the Magnitsky bill is very important. Getting Russia to WTO is probably a good thing in the larger scheme of things, but it's not going to help advance human rights in Russia. China, I think, is the best example of that. I think there was a question in back, and then that might be it if I'm missing anybody. Yeah,
one more in the middle.
One more in the middle, okay.
Maybe this is a good way to end. I'm Sally Stover from George Mason University and the Transnational Crime and Corruption Center there. So I've been working on these issues for a long time. How can we help you, Bill, to do what you're doing and get the word out and put pressure? I live in D.C., so I don't have a senator, et cetera, but maybe you could suggest some ways that we can actually help you.
Well, thank you. Thank you for coming, and we're always interested in specialists in transnational crimes, since we're dealing with some very serious transnational criminals. I think that there are several ways you can help us. One is by spreading the word, teaching your students. This movie will be posted on YouTube very shortly. To send it out to all your friends and colleagues and tell them to share it with their friends and colleagues. It's all about knowledge. If people knew what was going on, they wouldn't tolerate it. You can't watch this movie and not want to do something about it. And so it's all about sharing in the information and making sure everybody knows about it. And someone like yourself, who's a specialist, coming to Capitol Hill and testifying about your knowledge of these crime groups, so that people don't, there's a terrible misimpression that people look at Russia and they look just like us, the Russian regime, and they say they must just be like us. They must have our share our values. They don't. The Russian regime doesn't share our values. They operate more as a criminal organization than they do as a sovereign government, and people need to understand that. And the more people that are saying it, not just the victims of crimes, but dispassionate academics like yourself, that would be very helpful. We should probably
this one.
That's a question.
You said in the middle somewhere.
I think that was the lady.
Oh, okay. All right. I think that does it. Any last ones? Bill, thanks very much for sharing the video with us, ladies and gentlemen.